if we really wanted to come to the crunch and get down to business with all this stuff about fairy tales and myths and legends, if we really wanted to get to the very core of it, which if we're going to talk about it at all, I suppose we should do, then what we're looking at is the greatest, grandest myth of all. Although really what we're talking about is more of a blueprint of a myth than any actual myth. And the blueprint, the ultimate blueprint, could be said to be good versus evil. Now, as soon as you say this, for a lot of people, I'd say that a kind of switch would go off. When I say off, just turned off. And you'd be like, oh gosh, not that again, because we've heard it so many times. We've seen it enacted in very many bad films and bad stories. And worse than that, we've had it preached at us via the institution of the church to such an extent that the very notion of good versus evil has become irreparably tainted, I'd say, and impossible to see in a fresh way. And yet, just because this has been preached at us purely as a way of being able to control us, I might add, not for any love of the myth itself, not for any enjoyment in participating in that myth or adding something to it or working with the myth, but purely as a means of shutting us down. And the reason I say that is because it's very easy to invoke some literal translation of this myth and saying there's good and there's bad, and I'm good, or we're good. And if you go against what we say, then you're evil. So it's a control mechanism, pure and simple. It's no wonder it doesn't go down well with us. As I say, the church, historical church, the medieval church, has been going on about this a long time and promising us that we'll go to hell if we side with the side of evil, and tormenting us or frightening us with very graphic images of what hell is going to be and just how bad hell is going to be. But to this day, preachers of a certain sort delight in saying how bad Satan is. But if we can go beyond this, what we can say, to try and look at it in a way that hasn't been contaminated, is that there are these two principles. And we won't say good and bad because that's too interwoven with the moral framework. We could say deception versus the truth. And say that these are the two necessary principles for the drama of existence to unfold. So it is a working out between these two opposed principles that creates the dynamic tension of life, I suppose we could say. And this can be linked to the Hindu idea of forgetting versus remembering, which is the game of God. God, or Brahma, forgets himself, and then out of this collective amnesia which we all partake in, the force that brings us the other way is the force of memory. Occasionally we get an intuition. It's more like an intuition or a flash of insight than a normal memory, that there is more to this, that there is more to our lives than what we think there is, or what we're told there is, that the scene is actually far grander. And we get flashes of this, and then the flash goes. But that's part of the process of remembering. And we could also say it's like hide and seek in a way, that somehow we're hiding from ourselves, or reality is hiding from us, whichever way you want to put it. So straight away things get very complicated, because, as I've already said, it kind of makes sense that if you are on the side of the force of forgetting, or on the side of the force of deceiving, the first thing you're going to do is to claim to be on the other side, thus demonizing the light, demonizing true remembering, which now becomes heresy. So if we've been hoodwinked by the principle of deception, which pretends to be on the other side and pretends to be the principle of truth, then truth itself is denounced as a deception. And this is, of course, exactly what has happened with the Christian Church. Not all of the Christian Church, but the mainstream institution of the Christian Church. And Philip K. Dick has articulated this idea that the true Christians were replaced very early on, maybe only a matter of 50 or 100 years after the death of Christ, by the opposite side, so then Christianity. And there always have been Christians who have looked at things in such a way as to say that each one of us comes into the world with the ability to discern the truth, and that we don't need an intermediary, i.e. some kind of official, a bishop or a priest or a cardinal, to tell us what the truth is, because that's bad news. So what the Gnostics said is that we each come into the world with this one thing. We don't come into the world with much, maybe, but the one thing we are given is the ability to discern the truth. And that's a type of knowing which is called epinoia. And obviously this may not seem like much. We're not given a hell of a lot when we're coming into the world. We don't even know anything. We've got total amnesia. But we do have an ability to discern the truth. We're given that. And that should be enough if we listen to it. That will lead us in the right direction. But the ability to discern the truth is a very small thing, a quiet thing, and it's easily covered over by the bellowing and the roaring of the other principle, which is the principle of deception. But the principle of deception has this quality that it just doesn't speak quietly, as Philip K. Dick says. It bellows at us and roars at us so as to terrify us and coerce us, and that's its strength. It has the strength of being able to frighten us and browbeat us and cause us to crumble and accept the authority that we are being confronted with, because it's big and scary, and it's like it's very much like the negative father archetype. It's like the scary bad father who roars and shouts and pounds the table and pounds us all into submission because he's so big and he's so angry, and we're frightened of being punished, because if we do disobey, then we will be punished, and there's no doubt about that. So we could say that the false truth has to be backed up by this coercive control, by this force. It has to be, because that's all it's got going for it, because it isn't really the truth. And if the principle of deception were to keep it on a level playing field, it wouldn't get very far, or it wouldn't get very far, which I know is an anthropomorphic way of talking about it, but I'm trying not to personalize it as much as possible. So because of the luminous epinoia, we would suss out that, well, this is bullshit, and we'd go with the other one, which is the still quiet voice, as Philip K. Dick puts it. But it isn't a level playing field, because the principle of deception uses coercion and fear and intimidation techniques and bluff. It's a great big bully, in other words. That's how the principle works. And also it's smart, it confuses us, and it's devious. So we could say that the first move becomes, as we have said, the principle of deception, assuming the moral high ground and taking it from there. And that's not a hugely clever trick, but it's clever enough to hoodwink us for thousands upon thousands of years. And when Christians did come about, that did question the need for an intermediary, someone who tells us what's true and tells us critically how to interpret the Gospels, or how to interpret the holy books. They could see that that isn't right. We don't need this unelected intermediary to come and tell us what's true, because that's kind of abusive, really. So there were Christians who did not believe in the need for a middleman between us and the divine, and they were demonized. So the principle of deception said, look how deceptive Satan is. He's putting forward these very persuasive arguments, because they would attribute to Satan the ability to be incredibly deceptive, thereby, or incredibly persuasive and skillful in the means of deception, thereby distracting from their own deceptiveness. So in all of this, I'm not trying to say that one side is good and one side is bad. These are the two principles. The story works itself out between these two principles in some way. In some way, it's as if forgetting is needed in order for there to be remembering, which kind of makes sense, really. So if we were to translate the principle of the two forces of deception and truth into psychological terms, the first thing that we could see is that the thinking mind, while it has a use, also belongs on the side of the principle of deception. And the reason it does that is very, very simply because the rational mind presents us with pictures of reality that are definite, authoritative, and concrete. They're black and white, and they're certain, and basically the thinking mind is saying this is how it is. Now, automatically that means that thought is a deceptive phenomenon, simply because it is impossible to say what things are in their essence, or what reality is in their essence. So if anyone or anything, any agency comes along and tells us what things are, and we've got our wits about us, we know that they're on the side of deception. And also, when thought tells us what things are, it does this in a bullying way. It does it in a bullying way because it doesn't leave us any space to question at all, or entertain any alternatives. It's thought's way or the highway. We're given no power to discern anything. All we're given is the power to understand things in the way that we are being told to understand them. That's what thought does. And that isn't a power, obviously. It's not a freedom. We're free to do what we're told and see things, see reality in the way that we're told to see it. And that is thought. That is how thought works. How else could it work? That's the essential quality of it, which in a limited sense is perfectly okay and works perfectly well. But in a global sense, when it comes to the bigger picture, thought stops being a useful navigational aid and becomes a full-blown manifestation of the principle of deception. And that principle has very much taken hold of the modern world because we've placed such great belief in thought, trust in thought. We trust it implicitly. Which means that we only believe in the reality that can be defined or named. And if it can't be defined and named and measured and stated categorically, then by definition it doesn't exist. And thought will say, well, prove it, prove that it exists. All this kind of mystical, airy-fairy, hocus-pocus stuff. Prove it. But what it means when it says that is prove it on my black and white terms, which are not legitimate terms anyway, because they in no way reflect what reality is like. They only reflect what I've chosen way of understanding reality is like. They only reflect the game that we're playing. So that's the principle of deception at work again. So we can compare what we've just said of thought having this potential to be the principle of deception with the myth of the Demiurge. And what the Demiurge does, he creates a totally false reality and then bullies us into submission to accept that this reality is the only reality that ever could be. And then we're stuck in the false reality, hopelessly. Incapable even of imagining that there might be something else or that this isn't the full story, which is like brainwashing or conditioning. We've been programmed so thoroughly by thought that the only thing which is true is that which thought says is true. So that is the psychological side of the story of the Demiurge. And when we just read about the Demiurge in historical terms, we might think it's interesting, but not relevant. But of course it is relevant because this imprisonment in a false reality is going on to this very day, as much as it ever did. So if we think it's an interesting curiosity about how strange those folk were back then when they used to elaborate on such baroque metaphors or myths or stories, because we ourselves are so enlightened and we know much more clearly what what life is all about or what the universe is all about. This is an example of our very great foolishness, the very great foolishness that is the inevitable consequence of our imprisonment in a false reality. Okay, thanks for watching.